Hi, I'm Reggie Turner, and I'm here with Andy Overton and Henry House. The Flipside starts right now. Today we are joined with our special guest today, Dr. Julie Schablitsky, who is the Maryland Department of Transportation's Chief Archaeologist. She is here for a special project within our own Jonathan Street community. But first, we want to get to know a little bit about Julie and her work. So Julie, tell us a little bit about who you are.
Okay, I'm the Chief Archaeologist for the Maryland Department of Transportation State Highway Administration. And there I oversee almost a dozen archaeologists and architectural historians. So we're there to consider our impacts to archaeological sites, historic buildings, historic bridges, and help the department kind of plan around that. And if we can't avoid these sort of cultural resources, we try to minimize our impacts to those.
Excellent, excellent. Andy.
Yeah, I find it so interesting, obviously, when we're laying down roads in this country and these counties, and then all of a sudden you come upon something, right? And so it would be your job, obviously, to preserve that, but then also keep those roads moving. How does that work? How does that truly become a thing?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is we get out sometimes years before the bulldozers and the work really happens. So we're there in the planning stage. So if we know there's a project, for example, a roundabout, we're all familiar with roundabouts. So what will happen is I'll look at the plan, I'll see where they want to have that roundabout go in, I'll look at maps, we'll go ahead and hire maybe sometimes consultants to help us do the archaeology out there to make sure that if there is something there, we can try and plan around or maybe shift a little bit. So we're there way before the work happens.
Oh, excellent, yeah, excellent, preserving.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Henry.
Good question here is, how many departments of archaeology do we have under the state system? Is it just under the Department of Transportation, or is there multiple?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because a lot of times people also ask, where do archaeologists even get jobs? And so there's three main places where you're employed as an archaeologist. You can be in a university where you teach other students how and what archaeology is all about. You can also work for agencies like the State Highway Administration or the Maryland Historical Trust. And in those capacities, you are there because you're trying to follow the letter of the law, which includes both federal and state laws. So you're there to look at projects and try and avoid and design around those. But then you can also be a consultant archaeologist, meaning you sometimes will go with a private firm who then will work for a state agency or a federal agency. So there's a lot of different ways to go in archaeology, and there are definitely jobs out there.
Interesting.
So Julie, tell us, how did you become an archaeologist?
Well, I always get that question, why did you ever become an archaeologist? Well, when I was 7 years old, I was always interested in the past, and I'd go to the library and check out books on Egyptology and mummies and Mesoamerica. But as I began to go to school and learn more about the history in our past, I realized that sometimes the most exciting stories are in our own backyard. And so I began to do historical archaeology in the United States of America. And so that's where I've been concentrating my efforts. Because in addition to working for the State Highway Administration, I also work as an adjunct at the University of Maryland. So that way I do research, I reach out to different people, and I'm just really interested in not just the agency side, but also the academics. So research includes colonial archaeology, Civil War history, anything from, I'd say, the 1600s on up to the mid-20th century is in my wheelhouse, if you will.
Excellent. Henry.
Can you give us an example of what you found one of the most interesting digs that you've ever been involved with?
Yes, it was actually here in Maryland. I've done work in Scotland and of course in the Wild West doing mining history, but and even the Donner Party, where you may be familiar with the unfortunate immigrants who went across the country and then ended up being stranded in the mountains of the Sierra Nevada mountain range, where they had to resort to cannibalism to survive. So I did some work out there, but I would say the most exciting find that I've had has been in the state of Maryland. We were excavating at a slave quarter in Anne Arundel County known as Belvoir. And on that spot, I really wondered if there was a way that we could somehow find out more about the people who lived there. Because of course, people who were enslaved, a lot of times that history is silent and you don't have the great record you have of a lot of the planters. So in this case, I wanted to look specifically at tobacco pipes, and stems are often left on archaeological sites. If you've ever been to Colonial Williamsburg or Jamestown, you can remember those old clay tobacco pipes that people would smoke. Well, those are ubiquitous on archaeological sites. They're everywhere. So I thought, well, I wonder, in watching all those crime shows, I was wondering if there's DNA that still survives on those pipe stems, even 100, 200 years ago. So what we did is we were excavating, and I said, well, if we find pipe stems, let's collect them and see if we can send those to a forensic lab and try and lift some DNA off those. So we did that. We had 4 that we collected, and 2 of the 4 came back positive for human DNA. Those 2 pipe stems were then sent to a lab in Copenhagen. And the genetic scientist there looked at everything and ran his analysis. And it came back that one of the pipe stems was smoked by a woman who was most closely genetically to the Mende of Sierra Leone, West Africa.
Okay.
So what that means is that doesn't mean that she came from that part of Africa, but if she didn't, then her ancestors did. And that's kind of an exciting find for archaeologists because it's so rare to be able to take a place where people of African descent lived and kind of, in a sense, give them back that identity. So we know those that culture was here in Maryland.
Interesting.
Andy?
Yeah, so first, I'm from Nevada, so you talking
you
about
are?
the Donner Party is part of what we learned in Nevada history, so we're going to have to chat. I have so many questions for you. But really, I work in education now, so a lot of the women coming up in science sometimes, I don't think they realize the human connection that we have in archaeology too. What I'm hearing from you is that there's always a story you're trying to tell. So besides the Anne Arundel site, what's your favorite story that you have connected something that you went, oh my goodness, I never knew, and now I do?
Well, I think it's kind of an interesting way to get at it because does seem like archaeologists are all about the artifacts and the digging and the dirt and the finding the buildings underneath the ground. But as you go along in your career, you realize that it's about the people, and not just the people of the past, but the people living today. And so with that slave quarters site, we were able to find descendants of the people who lived there. And the magic and the power that happens when you bring those families back to the place where their ancestors lived and slept and worked is amazing. It really, it gets to you, and it reminds you, and I think invigorates you that this is what you're doing and it's right, and you need to keep doing what you're doing. So
Powerful, very powerful.
Is.
Yeah,
Excellent.
great.
Now, one of the pieces that I've shared with the team is the Maryland Public Television piece on the African American cemetery here in Maryland. Can you speak about that project?
The one in Hyattsville.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's an interesting project that we did where we had a parcel and there had been a cemetery on that from the 1880s. It was African American Baptist Cemetery church members. And they were buried there since that time period, 1880s, all the way up until about 1930s or so. And the church decided in the 1970s to go ahead and move the cemetery and sell the property and have it developed. They would take that money and then use it to find another location for their church. That happened, time marched on. In 2015, I know that the State Highway Administration wanted to go ahead and sell the parcel, but we knew that there could be human remains left on it. So what we did is we reached out to the church and we said, listen, we think that we might have something here, even though people were moved. Archaeologists know that when you hear of cemetery removals, not everyone is taken, not everyone is found. That's not just because it's difficult and expensive, but there's a lot of unmarked cemetery graves out there. So those graves have to be relocated. We went out there, we did a dig, so I was thinking that maybe we'd have another dozen people that were left behind we'd have to relocate in coordination with the church. And in reality, we ended up coming away with over 70 people. And some of them were partially removed, and there was one woman who was in a metal burial vault. And we talked to the descendants and we said, well, do you want to just pick her up and move her? Or we didn't even know who was inside actually at that point. And they said, well, at this point, we want to know who she is. Or he is. We didn't know who it was. Let's go ahead and open up the burial vault and try and reconstruct this person's identity. So we did that, and it was a woman, and she was perfectly preserved. There was a newspaper that was folded underneath her dress to kind of prop it up and position her when she was buried in 1938. And on that newspaper, there was a date of September 11th, 1938. So we knew she had to be buried about that time. We looked at historical records, and we found a person's name and the name was Elizabeth James Williams. And we thought it could be her, but we weren't sure. So we worked with Cece Moore, who is a genetic genealogist you may have seen on TV, and she was able to find who she thought might be descendants in California. So we took the DNA from, we called her the mystery lady at the time, and we looked at both their DNAs and reconciled that, ended up finding out that it was indeed this woman, Elizabeth James Williams, and that the people in California were her great grandnephew and great nieces. So in a way that we were able to give this woman back her identity. We found out she worked for the Pullman Car Company, which used to be the sleeper cars back in the 1930s, 1920s. And so we were able to learn who she was. We were able to kind of, in a sense, reunite the family who was in California with this ancestor. And we ended up reburying her in a full formal memorial service along with everyone else who we ended up finding. So it was a way to kind of give closure and do the right thing.
Absolutely. Andy?
Yeah, you know, this is really fascinating. For folks who are not in science like me, it's not my background, right? How do we find out more? Are there always reports that the state will generate so that we can look these up, find out more information? How do we learn more?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a Maryland Archaeology Facebook page. So if you just go to Maryland Archaeology, I'm kind of the wizard behind the curtain, and so I try to post as many things as I can about what we do. But we do, in some of the more compliance-driven projects for highways, we do what we call a gray literature report. So everything that we dig up, we document. And it's very thick, it's very dense, and it's very scientific. But the other thing we do, which I think is great for state highway, is we also have a public component. So if you see interpretive panels alongside the highway or at historic sites that have our logo there, that means we've been there, we've researched it, and we're trying to give back that information to the community.
So that's you. When I drive down and I see this historical marker, it's something that you guys have done. That's fascinating.
Yeah, and we also try to get out, we do public presentations, we visit schools. We're on the internet in all sorts of ways, story maps. So if you just Google us, you'll find us.
You'll find it. Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent. Henry?
Technology has changed probably a lot since you initially got into the field. You know, we see on TV ground penetrating radar on, you know, the NCIS or something along those lines. How does that apply in the work that you do? Does it apply with the work that you do?
Yes. The great thing about what you're asking is we call it remote sensing, meaning it's a way to, in a sense, get a little bit of information about what's in the ground without even hitting the soil. So before the shovel hits the dirt, we can use tools like that. Ground penetrating radar is something a lot of times people use to find buried utilities or tanks. And what we try to do is sometimes we can find burials, sometimes we can find buried buildings. And so if it's a nice open area, we'll drag this back and forth, and those radar waves will penetrate down through the soil and then hit and bounce back. It'll be captured, and we can look at the data that's generated from that to determine whether or not that something could be interesting enough for us to dig at that point.
Now, how deep can that scan down?
It depends on how good your machine is.
Okay.
So even in metal detecting, we use metal detectors all the time for battlefield sites, and so we'll be out metal detecting on Civil War sites, and so again, if your metal detector isn't very good, you can only go a couple inches, but if you have one of the really good ones, you can go down well over a foot. The same thing with GPR, ground penetrating radar, is you can sometimes go down several feet.
Yeah, well, see, I'm an Oak Island fanatic, so I see some of the stuff that they do. It's like, oh, this is really neat. But, you know, the way that it went about it kind of is a little iffy in my book.
Yeah, and the thing is that you never know until you dig. So even though those pieces of technology are great and helps kind of narrow down where X marks the spot, we still have to ground truth it to determine if there's something there and if that something is important.
Interesting.
Excellent. I would say the most impactful thing that I heard from your archaeological team is it's not what you find, it's what you find out.
Absolutely.
And that had a great impact on me yesterday when I was out at the site. So that'll be the last of this segment. Stay with us. When we come back, more with Dr. Julie. And we're back with Dr. Julie Schablitsky of the Maryland Highway Administration. And now what we would like to talk about is what she's doing in our community. She is a part of a project at 417 North Jonathan Street, which is a log structure that is estimated that has been in the community since the 1820s or so. But her work will tell us more about that. So can you tell me about the scope of the project and your involvement?
Yes, it was interesting because I didn't even know about this cabin or the great history of Hagerstown until Nick Redding, the executive director for Preservation Maryland, reached out to me and said, you know, listen, I think there's this really great opportunity that you might want to have come look at it with us. You know, there's this cabin. It's from the early 19th century. In fact, I first heard from Nick because I got this text and there was this picture of this nail in my phone. And it said, how old is this nail? I'm like, it looks like early 19th century. Where are you? And so that's when I first heard about this Jonathan Street cabin. And so that's how it all started. And I came there, I took a look, and I was fascinated because I couldn't believe that this humble-looking structure was along this kind of busy Jonathan Street road, and that had stood for that many years.
Yes, yes. Henry?
So that's how you got pulled into Hagerstown. How is this, the project, how is it going to proceed? What are your goals and aspirations for it? And, I guess, how is it going to be funded? Is it something through the local taxpayers, or how's that going?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is that what do we want to learn? That's the first thing you kind of wonder is what are their questions? I mean, if you know there's this cabin there, it's early 19th century, where do you begin? Well, we begin with the history. So we look at the historical records, and what we've learned so far is that it does look like it's a cabin built by people who were descended from German immigrants, the Fishers, and around 1830s or so, that's when the cabin was built. But then our questions became, well, who lived there afterwards? And what did those people leave behind? And what can we learn about daily life? Because we don't know that much about the people who lived there. We don't know what they ate, what they put on their table, if they had children. And just in the first day of the excavation, we're finding great things about the people who used to live there. So our goals are really about trying to find out just more about those people, okay. And even date the cabin, because we don't know for sure, and you can't always trust historical documents.
Right.
Andy?
Yeah. So I think I know the answer to this question, but why is it so important to hold on to this history? What is it really telling us about our future from an archaeological perspective? Why is that important to Hagerstown? So if a detractor said, that's history, why does that matter? Why does it matter?
It matters because, of course, the answer you always hear is that what happened in the past and how we reacted to it can inform the present and the future. And of course, we're really bad about listening to the past. And so I think we're there to remind people, of course. But I think it's also important that there are stories that are important to people today. Whenever I go into a community, what I see is when we go into the soil, into the backyards of people, and we begin to learn more about those who had lived there 100, 200, 300, sometimes thousands of years ago, is that it gives people a sense of place. It makes people in the community think about who came before them and why that's important. And so whenever you can be in a neighborhood and begin to really identify your roots with people's names, what they did, where they lived, what they were, how they even were associated with the town in the first place, I think that does something kind of inside of you that I think stimulates pride.
Excellent. Can I ask one more question, Reggie?
Shoot.
So all these artifacts that you may be pulling up and all this history, how do we keep that in Hagerstown? Does it stay here? Does it go to a museum someplace in Baltimore? How do we keep that here?
Well, artifacts, whether they're in your backyard or on state property, whoever owns a property owns the artifacts.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yes, but we always encourage the landowners that we work with to donate those to the state of Maryland. We have a large repository down in Calvert County known as the Maryland Archaeology Conservation Lab. And it has a facility that conserves artifacts. It preserves them, it makes them available to researchers. But the best thing is they're very, very friendly and very open to loaning those collections to different towns and cities and any historical society, for example. So if we excavate any sort of artifacts here, we prepare them, we analyze them, we're done with them, they'll go down and they'll be put in a place, a repository. But if the local historical society in Hagerstown wants to display them, it's a simple form, and the state is more than happy to get those artifacts back in the community. So,
create that connection.
Yeah,
Excellent.
yeah.
Thanks.
So Julie, your team has been here all week, and your communications team was here yesterday interviewing and documenting. How is this project being funded?
This project is being funded by, we have a special amount of money. It's federal money that is given to us to do stewardship, cultural resources stewardship. And so what that means is it has to have a transportation link. So in this case, we're looking not just at this cabin, but we're looking at Jonathan Street and the evolution of Jonathan Street from the 19th century through the 20th century, how it changed over time. And so we do have funding, a small amount of funding for that. And the important thing too is everything we're learning with that funding will be given back to the community in the form of interpretive signs, pamphlets, so any way that I can get out and share this. In fact, this right here is a way for us to get that message out.
Excellent. That sounds like tourism to me.
Yes.
Henry.
Okay. Is it, obviously it's fairly rare to stumble upon a cabin in this condition. It was hidden behind clapboard siding, I believe. Is that correct, Reggie?
Yes.
Okay. So it's fairly rare to discover. What can we really anticipate in your findings? I mean, what if this was a perfect world and you had the golden shovel and the magic sifter and you came up with, what would you hope to be able to find?
Well, the largest artifact on that site is the cabin itself. And so what's beautiful about that cabin is there's very few cabins left in the state of Maryland because of our weather. It's very humid, it's full of bugs, and that's not great for these wooden buildings. So in this sort of case, to know that in a sense it was kind of protected by the siding for so many years, and then when you take that off, all of a sudden you have this beautiful, rare gem in the middle of your community. You're lucky. It's almost in a sense a miracle. But what I'd like to do with this particular cabin is this week we're going to be having a dendrochronologist come out and look and core all the beams. A dendrochronologist is someone who takes a core in these beams, the cabin itself, and he'll take that and he'll compare the pattern of the rings of that core against a chronology that's known. So there's trees that have been standing for a long time. There's records that have been kept in the past about these patterns. So a very thick pattern on your core will be, it's a very wet season, and then sometimes it's a dry season, so you have this pattern that can be then matched up. So that will give us the exact date of when that tree was fell. So if you have a tree, it was logged in, say, the winter of 1800,
right,
you can use that then to determine how recent the cabin is. But the problem with this cabin, or the beautiful thing about this cabin, is that it's been made out of recycled timber. So we have timber that looks like it came from another building, and so we're probably going to get this mixed bag of dates, and it's all going to be down to the most recent date will probably give us when that cabin was actually put up.
Understood.
Andy?
Yeah, how does this spur off other projects? So if you're doing your thing at this site and you find something super interesting that could spur off into a different area of the city or the state, how does that funding work? How does that project work? Do you put it on hold for a while and get to it? What happens after that?
For this sort of like stewardship project?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so like a stewardship project like this, I decided that a week would probably be good for now. And so what happens is we go to that location, we excavate in the backyards, we excavate around the foundation of this cabin, because that's going to be, that soil around that cabin is going to be damaged when they put the new foundation underneath it. So we do that, and then we kind of step back and say, is there something more we want to learn? Is there something more we want to do? And I can tell you already, we were going to want to come back for a second bite of the apple, because there's a cellar underneath there, and that cellar might hold even more secrets and answers to what happened here, a long, long time ago.
Wow.
So we plan on coming back.
Incredible.
Excellent. So based on the amount of time you've been here this week, what would you say the community impact is going to be from this work?
We're on day 3, and we've had so many people just walking by, stopping by. They come to the side of the cabin, they look and they say, wow, this is amazing. I've lived in this neighborhood for years. I grew up here as a child. And they are just taken aback, and we never knew this was here, and this history, there's so much history here. And there's this huge desire from every single person that stops is to learn more and to make sure that people know about this community, about this neighborhood on Jonathan Street. They know the history, they know the importance, but it's really, I think, up to us to get that message out and to bring people in to see this.
Absolutely. Henry?
So I know part of the community plan is possibly to purpose the house and allow someone to move into it. In your historic experience, with your experience, do you feel, is it better as a opportunity for people to see as it stood back in, in that period of time, with the necessary things to refortify it, or to revamp it into something used for a housing opportunity?
Yeah, a lot of times we get these questions. You have these great historic buildings that are kind of all over the place in some ways, and people a lot of times want to just take the oldest house in the town and turn it into a museum, or have people be able to come out and tour it. The problem is sometimes historical societies or historical groups, they run out of funding or come in hard times, or there's a change in leadership. So then all of a sudden that historical building is vulnerable again. The great thing about taking a building like this and having someone live in it is that you have this situation called adaptive reuse. So you're allowing this building to kind of live on, house another family, and continue on its journey in history.
Interesting.
Andy?
So how much community involvement have we had? In other words, do you get kids coming up to the fence and saying, how do I learn more? What is that like? And I understand it's an archaeological dig. There's safety protocols, there's things that you're learning, but is there a way for folks to really become involved in the now, right now, and really see what you're doing and get excited? Or is it truly hands-off, which I would understand?
Yeah, and most of our public outreach projects we do have some sort of tours that come out, or children come out, and we have them wash artifacts or get their hands dirty or really see what it's like to be an archaeologist. But in the time of COVID, we have a lot of precautions that we have to have, and so unfortunately we can't do this at the time, but we do have to, and we should be looking at alternative ways to bring people to the site with our technology. So maybe we can do like a
live feed, anything,
or
right?
Cam, like a live cam, or even some sort of Facebook interview. So there are ways that we can begin to reach out to children and to the community in this sort of, even though we're kind of in tough times right now.
Yeah, I hear you.
Now, speaking of the buzz in the community, can you tell us a little bit about the different media outlets that have been in the community? I mean, this project started to receive national attention when it was in the Baltimore Sun roughly about 3 weeks ago, and your communications team has been out. Can you speak more in regards to the other media?
Yeah, so we have our Office of Communications who love the stewardship that we do and being able to talk about the history of transportation and the different sites along these highways and roadways. So we'll be getting hopefully a word out in the next couple of days about what we've been doing. We also have Maryland Public Television. They're doing a couple of shorts specifically on African American history, and one of them is going to be highlighting what's happening on Jonathan Street. So they're coming out tomorrow. We'll be filming, asking questions, and this will give us another great opportunity to get the word out about what's happening here in the community.
Absolutely. Henry?
From your history of Jonathan Street, I know the Sun article said it had been primarily a black community, but you said that construction was a German immigrant.
Yes.
About what time frame did that start to transition from, the German immigrant that built it? Maybe he was of the same working class as some black people within the community. Was it always that way, or when did the transition take place?
Well, the interesting thing is that Jonathan Hager, Hagerstown is named after, that's the parcel, he owned that parcel. So he had walked that property. So he was probably the first one that we know of that was walking around the backyard there. But as we started to research, we noticed by the 1830s, at some point between 1835 and 1840, a building seemed to have popped up based on the price of the parcel. And it was a Fisher family that bought it and built that cabin. And as you move forward, it seems to be primarily owned by white families or people of German ancestry.
Okay.
And then around the 1880s, it changes to being lived on by an African-American woman who lives in it for several years. And then it goes back to like a white, I think, laborer. And then by 1903, though, it's consistently occupied by black families. So that archaeologically is interesting because sometimes you can tease out nuances of the community and the culture from the artifacts, and being able to know that, we can then speak to that a little bit better.
Andy?
I want to go back to the media interest that's really kind of
Yes.
been around here. I mean, it's a buzz here in Hagerstown. It's truly a story that has captivated a lot of people. And I just have to know, is that normal? Like, do you go to a site and before you know it, the entire town comes around, or are we just truly that special?
You're truly that special. I mean, it always depends, but for some reason, and I'm not surprised, you do have just people, it's a great community and neighborhood because people are always walking, they're talking, they're out on their front porches, they're visiting with neighbors.
Right.
And so I see people, they're very much interested, they're invested in the community, and they want to see something happen, and now that it's happening, they're excited.
Yeah, that's great.
Now, other than this property transitioning from Jonathan Hager to his son and then to his daughter, from a historical perspective, what have you learned about this community?
When we first started looking at historic maps, we noticed that this parcel where this cabin is located had been since about the mid-19th century always on the edge of Hagerstown. It had been out in the country, it was open, it was probably pastoral. And as time marched on, we went from a community that was primarily white and homogenous, German immigrants, and then it began to change in the late 19th century. And when that change happened, you start to see things getting busier and more active. Today it's a very, very active community, and I just think it's very, very kind of interesting that you have people that are probably descendants of those same people that lived in that cabin just around us. So I'm interested to actually meet some of those people.
Absolutely. Andy?
Yeah, and it's interesting because we started off by talking about a picture on your phone of a nail, right?
Yes.
So we began with a picture on your phone of an artifact of some sort, and now in 3 days you have all this information about this home and about the city. And I have to ask, is that a normal timeline, or are there times where you could go weeks and really try and figure out what you have dug up and what you have seen, and you don't have a lot of background, or is this a normal thing? Is this how it works?
Well, it's not always how it works because a lot of times we don't know where the archaeology sites are. So what we try to do is we try to go out and do the surveys to find those sites. But in this case, this cabin is telling us where X marks the spot. And so we're able to, take this cabin and really begin to better understand what's left behind and around this important structure.
Yeah, cool.
All right. We'll wrap there. When we come back, Julie has some artifacts to share with us, and we'll see those after the break. And we're back with Dr. Julie Schablitsky of the Maryland Highway Administration, and we are to the exciting part of the show for her to be able to talk about artifacts that she has found this week at the dig at 417 Jonathan Street. Julie, tell us a little bit about what you have.
Yeah, so some of the most interesting artifacts that we're finding have to do with, they're called domestic artifacts or personal artifacts. And whenever we find children's toys, that's really exciting. We found bits of tea sets, marbles back there, and even this little shoe here, which is kind of interesting. It's from a doll. And just with this artifact from the 19th century, we know that there were little girls running around in the backyard. And so it really, in a sense, brings the site to life. So it's a small artifact, but we have screens that we catch the soil in, so that's kind of always interesting.
Wow.
I know. The other thing that's kind of interesting too that we found is slate or slate pencil. So before you have your pens or your pencils, they use slate. And so we find bits of slate and slate pencils. And so you can just imagine, again, a child learning their arithmetic or practicing letters on a board. And this is what they would have used, and they would have sharpened it down. And sometimes in archaeological sites, it's great because we end up only finding just the little nubbin of it. So they use it all the way until the end.
So this is a large piece for you.
This is a really large piece, but it's very skinny. So usually they're sometimes a little bit bigger. But yeah, so slate pencil.
Slate pencil.
Alcohol bottles are common, as are tobacco pipes. They're, like I mentioned, are ubiquitous. This is a piece that would have been gone down and around. It had a large bowl. So these are fragile. You drop it, they break in a lot of different pieces. So this would be a tobacco pipe, and we could have done DNA on this, but we didn't.
Maybe you'll find more.
Yes,
Yeah,
well, there's
right.
always going to be more, absolutely. So your typical tobacco pipe.
What era would you say for the tobacco pipe?
19th century, and they go up to about the 20th century.
Okay.
So that's in that transition from that century. So, but we have more of them. We have pipe bowls out there as well. everyday items. You see that, you go down the street today and you see Jonathan Street and you see this cabin, it's rustic and it's dark inside, and you forget that it used to be a home where people were cooking and learning and raising a family and serving food and dinner. And the types of objects that would have gone on tables and on shelves and in cupboards include pieces like this. It's edgeware, it's a green edgeware, it's very common. A lot of times you see these artifacts with blue on the rim here. But this one is extra special because this takes us all the way back to the 1820s, 1830s. So this would have been one of the first artifacts that came into that cabin and then was eventually broken and ended up in the backyard for us to find. So
how do you know it comes from the 1820s? What about that little piece, other than you're just awesome at what you do, right?
No.
But truly, what tells you it's from that area?
So what tells us is that archaeologists for a long time have been studying ceramics.
Yeah,
and so this particular piece has a certain curve on the edge, it has a certain paint application, and it's got a certain design that's raised here. And so all those design and application techniques have been documented so that when we find this, we can automatically say, oh, well, this is 1820s, 1830s, and it came from England.
So I should take my IKEA bowls that I have now and break them in my backyard. So in 200 years, right? Okay, I got it.
Yeah,
I got it.
It'd give me something to find.
Yeah, right.
So there you are.
Thank you.
So what ended up in the backyard, in addition to the dishes, of course, were the dinner bones. I think these are called faunal remains or animal bones, and they're very important. This one might be from a pig, but pork, beef, all sorts of animal bones end up in the backyard because people eat and then they throw their trash in the backyard, and that's why we find it today. We don't have somebody coming along in the corner and taking it away. So this piece is interesting because the more we find, the more we can begin to reconstruct people's diet, how they lived, what they had access to, what their preferences were. So it's nice to be able to study these bones as well.
Neat.
Getting back to personal items, sometimes you get things that have monograms on them, and this particular piece is a button, and if you look closely, it has the letter H on it. And we all joke that it's from Jonathan Hager, which we can't say that. It could be, Harriet or Helen or somebody, but it would have been in an insert. It could have been a brooch. It could have been a button. So we don't know yet. But again, it's something that's personal and personalized, and again, it humanizes the past.
Is that ink or is that?
It looks like it's carved into it.
It's
like
carved
it's
into
bone.
it.
It's made out of bone, and somebody must have carved that into it to personalize it.
Holy
Yeah.
cow! Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
And one of the first artifacts that we found on day one of the dig was this silver coin. I believe it's probably a silver dime, and it has a hole punched in it, and it looks like they may have used a cut nail, which is from the 1800s. And the person would have worn this on themselves, around their neck, perhaps their wrist. And when we find this, a lot of times we associate it with people who believed in root work or hoodoo. Sometimes we just call it West African spirit practices. And this person had worn it around their neck to protect themselves. And a lot of times it is associated with African Americans, like I said, but it could be also white people as well. But this thing was rubbed so much that you can't even see what was on it. So we call it devotional wear. So it's just been rubbed, and there was a belief that if it turned black, it was working. And we all know, though, that silver tarnishes black. So it was always working.
And and so you're saying it was rubbed because of the person wearing it, not because of the elements of being in the ground.
That's exactly right.
Holy cow.
It's called devotional wear, and the person would have been wanting to protect themselves.
And there's really nothing else on here other than that hole in the top, and that is the clue for you.
Yeah, and the thing is that
amazing.
That size, though, and just what we found in the past as archaeologists, is that we often find silver dimes that are used particularly for that purpose.
Why dimes?
They're made out of silver.
So it's a material rather than that. Okay,
yes.
I got it.
Yep. Sometimes even the birth date of the person. So if you're born, say, in 1876,
you find an 1876 dime.
You're going to put that around your neck.
Got it.
Absolutely.
Right. Henry.
This is fascinating. I know you found other things, and you anticipate to find a whole lot more. We think, oh, well, the trash people, they'll come, they'll pick their trash up and take it and bury it. But you're going to have an entire backyard of artifacts of history that has accumulated over the last 200 years.
Right.
So is it going to be kind of layered that, oh, well, 1820, 1830, 1840, or how do you anticipate, what was the history? Did they dig holes and just bury in the hole and cover it up and then move to another section of the yard? How was that handled?
Well, this is where the science kind of takes off, is that when people began to throw things away, they would throw them out and just kind of throw them away in their backyard. And sometimes they'd have holes and they'd fill the holes with their trash. So what happens when the archaeologists come around, we have to basically excavate each one of those layers in a methodical way. So think of a Smith Island cake, if you will. It's got all those
Right.
layers in it. So we excavate one layer at a time until we get on the bottom. Each one of those layers is usually, the deeper layer is always the oldest layer in most cases. So when that happens, we can then begin to tease out activity areas, we can tease out who lived when and where and whose artifacts those were. So we can keep control of all of that. All those artifacts then, those, say 1,000 artifacts will end up, they're all going to bags, their own separate bags, and we take those back to the laboratory in Baltimore, and they'll be washed, they'll be analyzed, and they'll be cataloged. And then that's when, again, more work happens, where the science comes into play. So we'll look at numbers, we'll look at distribution, we'll look at how this collection is similar to other collections across the state of Maryland. And what we learn there, how can it tell us what's happening here in Jonathan Street? How is it the same? How is it different? And how does it make that cabin unique?
Excellent. Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I have 1,000 questions and no more questions. Like, we could just do this forever, but I can see when you hold those in your hand, you're holding this piece of possibly 200-year-old history that you found in a backyard of a cabin here in Hagerstown that's powerful. And I can obviously see the passion of pulling this together and really being able to say, here's what life was like, and probably not much unlike ours now, just in a different time with obviously not IKEA bowls.
Yeah.
I mean, I see that. So thank you. It's amazing.
Henry, did you have something else?
Well, I guess the question is, this is Hagerstown, you have this discovery. How does it compare to other sites that you've had similar discoveries, or is Hagerstown truly that unique because of how, it's 200 years plus since that house was built? Are we just that unique for the way that's been preserved?
I think what's unique about Hagerstown is, especially Jonathan Street, is it is this unopened book. And I feel that, and to be honest, each one of those homes is a book in a library, and Jonathan Street is the library. And so, in a way, we've taken down that first book, 417 Jonathan Street, and began to look at and begin to read it. But this is just the beginning. There's more to learn here, and I think that this particular site is interesting and unique and valuable because it's such a small lot and so much is concentrated in that space, and it's also one of, if not the oldest buildings in the town that still survives. So I'm excited to see what else it's going to tell us.
Excellent. Anything else, Andy?
Oh, no, I'm enamored. And I have 1,000 more questions, but we don't have time for it, so I'll reserve them for later.
All right, great. We have one more segment with Dr. Julie. We hope you stay with us. And we're back with Dr. Julie Schablitsky for our last segment. Julie, one thing that I wanted to talk about in regards to the artifacts in the cabin, there's a larger area in the back of the home that you're concentrating on. I know that there was some initial talk that there possibly could be a building that is back there. Where are you with that portion of the project?
Yeah, what we want to do on places where we know there's the main house is we always look for outbuildings, whether it's a dairy or a smokehouse or a wash house, a detached kitchen. So archaeologists are always looking along the lot lines, even for privies, old outhouses, believe it or not. So we've been looking along the lot line, we've been looking in the center, and we came up with what looked like yesterday, it could be a foundation. There are a lot of large rocks that seem to be out of place there, and so that's always curious to us. So today we went ahead and opened up a large unit just to the side of it, but didn't come down upon anything. But I think tomorrow we're going to shift to the north and open it up even more. So we could come up with a building in the back there. So that's exciting.
Excellent. Andy?
Yeah, I can only imagine that property lines shift, right, throughout hundreds of years. So can you just talk a little bit about, I mean, if you find something underground, maybe you do find another house, and it's over several different property lines, how does that work? Do you have to call those property owners? Do you say, hey, this is super important? What happens then?
Yeah, so if you end up having, and that's not uncommon, is that
Sure.
where you might have one part of a site and it's on another parcel or property owner, you just ask permission. I mean, that's just ask them, let them know what you're doing, and sometimes you can definitely look at both sites, and most people are pretty good about letting us have permission because they know it's important, and they're willing to share the history, and if they're excited about their property and their house, they're more than happy to have us come in there and learn about it.
But it's not uncommon. It happens all the time.
Yeah, exactly. And with
Wow.
roads too. I mean,
I'm sure,
and you
yeah.
think about like Native American sites with, before there were roads, there were Native American sites, and a lot of our highways sometimes,
Yeah.
we'll have gone through those, and so we have to make sure that we look at all the artifacts and archaeological sites that can be along our roadways.
Yeah, fair enough.
Excellent.
Now, I know we're wrapping up the show tonight, so I have a question for you. How can locals, is there something locals can do to be of service, either to your site, or if we stumble upon something in our own backyard? What's your recommendations?
Yeah, so depending on where you live in Maryland, you can go to an historical society, you can go to the Maryland Historical Trust, or if you want to, you can call me. I mean, I'm more than happy to direct you in the right location. So if you have something in your backyard, or if you have an historic house that you found something in, I'm more than happy to field those questions and direct that person to the right resource.
And with the project that you're working on now, is there anything that, except for being spectators walking by and waving to you, there's not too much that we can do locally to?
Not this time. I mean, definitely cheer us on and be watching for us. I think that this is just the first time that we go to an archaeological site and start digging. That's not the last time you're going to hear from us. So this is just the beginning. You're going to see us coming back, and you're going to see us in the newspaper. You're going to see us on the internet, and so just watch for it.
Okay.
And if you're interested in donating towards this project, the pin that I have on, Save All the Old Houses, if you would go to www.circaoldhouses.com, you're able to purchase this pin for $25, and those funds go directly towards the project. What advice can you give us in regards to amateur archaeologists that are becoming sparked by this, like my daughters, in regards to little projects they can do in their own home or own yard to spark interest and see what's available?
Well, there's a lot of interest, as you know, in archaeology, and there's also enough and a lot of different organizations out there that will bring you on, and you can volunteer with them. So if you're interested in archaeology, there are volunteer organizations. If you go to the Maryland Archaeology Facebook page, you can leave a message and ask us for, if you're in Anne Arundel County, or if you're in Hagerstown, I can direct you to the right resource so that you can get your hands dirty.
Excellent. Andy?
I have a very scientific question for you. So if I'm in my backyard with my metal detector, can I wear the Indiana Jones hat? Will that actually make me find things a little bit more, or is it truly the science behind it all? I have to know.
You can wear the hat.
Thank you.
I'll let you wear the hat.
I was talked out of wearing the hat during the dig, so I'm a little disappointed you got free reign. Henry?
If you have any unique discoveries, do you see it possibly spilling over on the lot beside where you're digging?
Well, that lot has been the same lot for into the 19th century. So
the lines haven't changed.
The lines haven't changed in this
Wow.
case.
Okay.
I know. So
Wow.
a little bit, probably wiggle a little bit, but for the most part, what you see today is how.
So it's not like the old, my property line started at the oak tree, ran to the corner.
As far as
of,
the eye can see.
Yeah.
Turn at the rock.
Yeah, down to this rock, and so it was actually a measured, staked out lot.
Yeah. In fact, it actually went all the way farther to the west, all the way back. So there's a development back there now, but it was actually a lot longer shotgun lot.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, the lot originally went all the way back to Subins Avenue. Now the housing project that is there cuts that off, and because that was taken through eminent domain through the last homeowner's time that he was there in the home.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a shame.
Yeah.
Yeah, who knows? We could have found
What's
something
underneath,
back there.
yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
And that's why it's so important that so much has been lost. And whenever we have a chance to save a cabin like this, we have to take that chance.
First, we would like to thank you, Dr. Julie Schablitsky, for coming in, sharing your expertise with us and all these wonderful artifacts and the wonderful job that you and your team are doing in this community. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I had a great time.
Great. That is all the time we have tonight. We hope that you'll follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, send us your comments and suggestions and feedback at theflipsidetv.com. That is feedback at flipsidetv.com. More importantly, we hope that you will join us again next week for another visit to the Flipside.